Well, I'll add my thanks to being included. And for those who have been keeping count, I am speaker number 40. And the last one. So I am the 40th and last speaker. So faith in God and the health of people are universal. 7.3 billion people in the world, and 84% of them are religiously affiliated. So Christians, rounding it, 31%, Muslims, 24%, the unaffiliated, 16%, Hindus, 15%, Buddhists, 7%, folk religions, 6%, other religions, 0.8%, Jews, 0.2%. That is to say that when relief and development workers come around, or public health officials, when they get there, the synagogue and the mosque and the church and the temple are already there. And after they're gone, those are still there. So they are the continuing parts of a community and have enormous influence. So I come to you as an American, as a Protestant and an evangelical Christian, and of course, I'm rooted in my own country and my own traditions' involvement. Evangelicals around the world are actually a growing movement, about 600 million. In the United States, about 30% of the population, so that's somewhere between 90 and 100 million people out of our 320 million Americans. It's kind of interesting to see what the breakdown is racially and ethnically. 44% of African Americans are evangelicals. They're by far the largest, not in absolute numbers, but in percentage of constituency. Hispanic Americans, 30%. White Americans, 29%. So in absolute numbers, there are more white Americans who are evangelicals, but if you meet someone on the street, the most likely person out of their group is an African American. As far as how we identify, evangelicals are not particularly an institution, it's more of a movement. So around the world, but within the United States, it is thousands of different churches and schools and publishing houses and denominations, just a great variety. The common thread, in the simplest of terms, is that we take the Bible seriously and that we believe in Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. For research and technical purposes, the marks of identity are the authority of the Bible, Jesus Christ, salvation, and activism, including evangelism. When it comes to the environment, the Bible does not start with environmental stewardship. It starts with God, so it is theocentric. So commitment to the environment is a reflection of a commitment to God. And it is an outflow of caring for God's creation, and that includes caring for God's people. And although not all Christians have adhered to the teachings of the Bible on care of creation or the moral imperatives of Jesus on the care of the poor and vulnerable, these are still foundational to who we are and what we believe. So in 2010, evangelicals from 198 nations gathered in Cape Town, South Africa, in what some would say would be one of the largest universal gatherings of Christian representation. It was under the auspices of an evangelical group called the Lausanne Movement. And they issued a statement, a declaration called the Cape Town Commitment, and it's long. But I just want to read to you a few lines that relate to the environment and stewardship. The Cape Town Commitment says, all human beings are to be stewards of the rich abundance of God's good creation. And then it gets specific. So this is what evangelicals believe. We lament over the widespread abuse and destruction of the Earth's resources, including its biodiversity. Probably the most serious and urgent challenge faced by the physical world now is the threat of climate change. This will disproportionately affect those in poorer countries, for it is there that climate extremes will be most severe and where there is little capability to adapt to them. World poverty and climate change need to be addressed and need to be addressed together and with equal urgency. And then there's specific actions that were adopted. Remember, leaders of 198 nations. Number one, adopt lifestyles that renounce habits of consumption that are destructive or polluting. Number two, exert legitimate means to persuade governments to put moral imperatives above political expediency on issues of environmental destruction and potential climate change. So that was the international statement, adopted in 2015 by the National Association of Evangelicals for the United States. I want to tell you about a book that's actually not released yet. It's going to come out next month, Oxford University Press. The title of it, which I think should be fascinating to most here, is Religion versus Science: What Religious People Really Think. And it's co-authored by Elaine Howard Eklund, whom I know well, and Christopher Sheatley. They are at Rice University in Houston, Texas. This is funded by the John Templeton Foundation and is a project that I participated in that was the root to it, with the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And they interviewed or surveyed 10,000 Americans, religious, non-religious, and scientists. So you can compare what scientists say, non-religious people, and religious people. And it's a long book, so I've read the manuscript, but it comes out next month. But I just want to read two questions and what the answers were. One of those questions was, tell us how interested you are in the environment, and how many say very interested in the environment. All respondents, 32%. Evangelicals, 28%. Mainline Protestants, 31%. Catholics, 32%. And Jews, 34%. The other question of interest is, how committed are you to the idea that the climate is changing and human actions are a significant cause of the change? All respondents, 42%. Evangelicals, 35%, mainline, 42%, Catholics, 42%, Jews, 44%, non-Western religions, 55%, unaffiliated and atheists and agnostics, 49.9%. Now, I don't know if you can remember all of those numbers, but what is interesting is there is only one religious group that is over a majority, and that is non-Western religions. They actually are a higher percentage than atheists, agnostics, and the non-affiliated. So I think that the differences are statistically significant, but they all fall short of a majority. So overall, most Americans of all religious affiliations say that they are not very interested in the environment and that they don't affirm that climate is changing by human action. So you start putting all of that together, and to me, that comes to some conclusions. My conclusion is that evangelical Christians are not unusual in this, and that we are not much influenced or persuaded by those who espouse values that are contrary to our faith. And what that is in communication to me is, what is your initial premise? And if your initial premise is the authority of the Bible, or your initial premise is the authority of the Vatican, or your initial premise is the authority of the Quran, then persuasion must be based upon that initial premise, and it must grow out of that. And if your initial premise is research, science, and the authority thereof, you are switching someone's initial premise. And that would be like coming into this room saying, let's all switch your initial premise to the authority of the Quran and then have our discussion. And that probably wouldn't work. So if we're going to persuade religious people, we need to begin with what is their premise, not what is the premise of those in this room or the scientific community. People are most interested in building off their premise, which leads to care of creation and concern for those who are poor and vulnerable. So at the risk of not using all my time, is that acceptable to not use all of my time? All right. Then let me tell you my conclusions on how to do this. And I would say it's true for evangelical Christians, but I would say it's probably true for any religious group. And a couple of these have already been touched on, but to reinforce, if we're going to succeed at this, number one, leaders need to give voice from those whom they trust. Trusted leaders are extremely important. Number two, persuasion begins with the tenets of the faith, not scientific consensus. Not that scientific consensus isn't highly valued and important, it just has got to align with the tenets of whatever that faith may be. Number three is that environmental catastrophes that dominate the news create opportunities for engagement and persuasion. But those who seek to persuade should be prepared in advance before that unpredictable catastrophe occurs, so that social media and explanation are ready to go when the catastrophe strikes, because 3 weeks later, it is less persuasive. And number four is that scientists within the faith, let's say within evangelicalism, but scientists within the faith may have disproportionate influence because they understand the terminology of both science and of the religion. An example in America is Catherine Hayhoe. So Catherine is listed as one of the 100 most influential women in the United States. Maybe it's the world, I forget how Time magazine classified her. She is an evangelical Christian. She is a scientist at Texas Tech University. She is the wife of an evangelical pastor. And she has enormous credibility and influence, and she's persuasive because she can speak the language of evangelical Christianity and of the scientific community, and she can bring them together in a persuasive way. Time's not up, but I am.